Hi folks, I'm Wes Kale. Welcome to the program. Today we're going to be talking about making lists. Now, lists are perhaps the most elemental tool that you can have in your toolkit. You don't need any special software or any special training in order to make a list. What you really need is the will to do so, the will to make lists of the things that concern you. And that's going to be the primary theme of this videocast, is that if you're not making lists today in order to structure the work that you have before you, we're going to want to encourage you strongly to begin making lists. Now, we touched upon the importance of list making in videocast 3, where we identified it as being among the top 5 practices for successful project managers. Well, in today's videocast, we're going to give you a broader treatment of the topic of lists and provide you a couple of templates that you can use in making lists to structure your work. So with that said, let's take a look at our agenda. In our first topic, lists and management, we're going to define what we mean by making a list and how this affects our personal organization. Then we'll talk a little bit about why we need lists. While this may seem obvious, there's actually a couple of pieces to this that you should understand. Then, in list types and tools, we'll talk about the 4 basic groups of tools and how you choose which tool to use in different situations, because one tool does not solve all problems. Next, we'll look at the dynamic nature of lists. While making a list is a finite act, most lists have a life cycle that can extend for some period of time, and they can only be effective if you understand their dynamic nature and learn how to manage the flow of material onto and off of the list during the lifetime of the list. In making a list, we're going to take a deeper look at how to choose tools for making your list and how to structure and maintain the most common list you will use, a list that tracks tasks and issues, something we call the detailed task list or DTL. And finally, we'll review. So the first thing is, what is a list? Simply stated, it is nothing more than an itemization of concerns. And while this may make intuitive sense to you, it is actually a very powerful description. We don't do lists for the heck of it. We develop lists because there are things that are of importance to us for one reason or another that we want to write down and track. Lists capture things that worry us. Now, the degree of concern may vary, but we don't put things on a list unless we're a little worried about them. Otherwise, why would you develop a list? This is an important point to remember because the deduction from this is not always true. That is, because there are a bunch of work-related things that are important to us, that does not mean we consistently exercise the discipline to write them down in a list. And that is precisely why we're doing this videocast. We want to exhort you to make lists, to track things that concern you. Now, the folks who happen to be J's under the Myers-Briggs type inventory, also known as the MBTI, are probably beside themselves with glee at the moment because by temperament, they are inclined to make lists of everything regardless of whether the items are of concern to them or not. Now, this is also true of P's under Myers-Briggs, but P's tend to make lists and then promptly lose them, so the P's don't count. However, I'm not trying to pat either the J's or the P's on the back. Rather, I want to make the point that the making of lists is a professional responsibility, it is a discipline, and that we must get beyond merely saying things are important and exercise the discipline to behave appropriately with those things that we say are important to us. We need to make lists, and we'll talk more about this shortly. Secondly, it is important to understand that lists are an itemization. They are not a bundle, they are not a bunch, they're not a group, they're not a collection, they're not a lot, they're not a relative description of things. Lists are discrete identification of things that are competitors for our attention. For lists to be effective, we have to be able to see what each item is and be able to consciously evaluate it at some level relative to the other items on the list. This is because we're going to have to choose what on the list we're going to focus on at a given point in time and what we're not. If our concerns are this amorphous blob with no definition, then there is nothing for us to concentrate on. So you need to understand that lists are a structured series of concerns, not just a bunch of concerns. Relatedly, lists are most useful when they contain concerns of the same magnitude. For example, you wouldn't want to mix a project portfolio up with the test cases for a single requirement of one of the projects in that project portfolio. It just wouldn't make sense. While you could do so physically, you'd be switching back and forth in your mind between the detailed view of the test cases and the more operational or strategic view of evaluating projects in the portfolio. So don't lump things together that are not of the same magnitude. And not to be funny, but here's a list of some of your most common lists. You'll typically have a list of tasks, a list of issues, or accounts that you may have, or sales leads, projects, etc. All sorts of different types of lists. Now, one of the things we need to understand about lists is that as leaders, whether of a project or of an organization, one of our fundamental responsibilities is to establish order. And lists are the first and fundamental step in so doing. The simple act of writing down on a list the concerns that surround us is a force for pushing back the entropy and the uncertainty that comes with both problems and change. Now, we'll face this challenge of maintaining order in both our personal and professional lives. Our focus is on your professional life. While making sure you get the groceries and change the oil in your car and picking up the dry cleaning is important for you in making sure that you stay personally organized, the negative impacts of failing to stay organized affect only you personally. However, your degree of professional organization has a dramatic effect upon your peers and staff, and that is why we're going to direct our attention to work-related lists. So let's now talk about why we do lists. And the most elemental reason why is that you can't track it all. The simple fact is that if you are a fully involved person, i.e. you're not just someone who's taking up space somewhere and drawing a paycheck, you're someone who's actually contributing to the organization, there are going to be too many issues and action items and projects and risks and everything else for you to keep it all straight. You're going to need a list. So what is important is for you to sense when there's too many bits of information floating around and that you need to clear your head, you need to get it down on paper, you need to know your limits. The situation is analogous to moths flying around a light, or in this case, your head. There may not be that many of them, but they're so close to you that you can't get a good read on them, and as they bump into you, they're distracting. So you've got to swat them away by making a list. Now, you may think you've got a good memory and that you don't need a list. That's wrong. I've known 3 people in my professional life who have had either a photographic or audiographic memory, so that everything they either saw or heard was locked away. But even then, memory is not the only issue with why you make lists. These individuals still maintain lists because they recognize that the ability to focus, the need to prioritize their work, and the need to communicate with others were also limitations that a list was helpful with. So everyone needs to make lists, no exceptions. Once again, the MBTIJs are probably tickling themselves. Now, an important consequence of recognizing that you can't track it all, and another reason why we do lists, is that you're trying to cover the cracks in your organization or your project. By writing things down, you make sure that important, if not urgent matters, do not get forgotten, and you ensure that planning and execution are informed by all the little conditioning elements that might have been overlooked. A third reason is strictly psychological. With all management work, completion is a matter of degree, and completing one item merely bleeds into the next. For example, you may write the annual goals and objectives for each person in your department. Great, that's done. But now you have to review those goals and objectives with each staff member, and some of them will have changes or concerns that will require further discussion. And then when that's done, now you've got to remember to monitor the performance until next year when you do this all over again. So whether you're a project manager, a department manager, or a CEO, management work never seems to have a clear completion endpoint. While it can help ground you and give you a perspective that you are at least making progress as you trudge through the mud of management work, if you're able to tick off things on your list as you knock them out. While you may never be able to declare victory or spike the ball in the end zone, you will at least know that you're not just wasting your time. Now, while this may be helpful from a psychological perspective, the reverse is also true of making lists. One of the reasons why folks don't like making lists is that they don't want to see all the things that they have to do. Seeing a long itemization of all the things that are not done can just be disheartening. Getting over this, too, is a personal discipline issue that has to be overcome by taking a deep breath and recognizing that finding the motivation to move forward is separate from knowing what you need to work on once you find that motivation. And the final reason you should make and maintain lists is that your managers are going to be checking on it to make sure that you actually are doing so. If you're not, that may be a problem. We'll talk more about this at the end of the show. Now, I'm sure you can come up with some other reasons about why we need lists, but I think these are the biggies. So let's move on to talk about the different types of lists. The first thing to understand is that one list isn't going to do it. There's not one size fits all here. The simple fact is that the nature of the things that we need to track varies so much that no single list will be perfect. While there are evangelists out there for different tools that may wish to argue with that, I think a quick look at the metadata attributes that describe the things that we track on lists will show what I mean here. And I think a good list of these metadata attributes is what you see here. Walking through these, count deals with how many items that we're going to need to track on the list at any one point in time. Urgency is how important it is to quickly address the item. Duration refers to how long we expect to have to track this item before we can close it out and ignore it and move on to other items. Risk could also be viewed as importance, but the real issue here is how bad is the downside risk if this item drops through the cracks and we forget about it. Detail refers to the degree of supporting information we're going to need in order to effectively track and manage this item. And coordination with others and reporting refer to how we want to use this list in order to effectively influence the work of groups. Now, to reemphasize, together these attributes determine what types of lists are appropriate for what types of circumstances. This is different from the actual data elements that we're going to need to track on our items on our list. Here we're focused upon determining what type of list we should be using. We are not concerned with the data elements that we're going to capture on those lists. And here's a little table that lines up some of the common tools that are out there that we can use for lists, as well as these attributes so we can get a feel of what types of problems these tools address. Now, to orient you a little bit, I've arrayed the attributes across the top here. You'll see that we've got attributes that pertain to the item, and then we've got attributes that kind of pertain to the list, the group of items. And over here, I have our tools, our common list that we could use. Now, Post-it notes probably need no introduction. These are the ad hoc lists which we generate just by jotting down the title of an item of concern as a prompt to remind us later on. I've lumped the task list on your phone as well as Outlook into this task list level to capture those items you'll need to refer to on an occasional basis, but you're not using them to drive events in your work life. Now, some professional users of Outlook may object to that. My comments aren't directed at them. If they know how to use Outlook in an Exchange environment to work with groups, then it has as much power, if not more, than OneNote or Excel. But I'm focusing my comments more at the folks who are lay users of Outlook, not the professionals. Then we go on to OneNote and Excel, and these are two clearly more powerful list-keeping systems that go beyond simple task and to-do tracking. And finally, we have specialized software for maintaining lists that could range from Salesforce.com for tracking leads, to Doors for tracking requirements, to Microsoft Project Server for tracking projects in the enterprise. Okay, so we got all these different types of list tools, we got these different attributes. Now let's see how they're different. So what's interesting is to look at how the attributes break out across each one of them. Now, what I have here in red are the principal reasons why we choose a given tool. So for Post-it notes, the urgency of the issue, the fact that we only want to track a small number of them, and the fact that those issues aren't going to be around very long because we're going to knock them out are the principal reasons why we choose Post-it notes. While Post-it notes allow us to manage some risks and to capture some detail around a given item, that's really not why we chose a Post-it note. And Post-it notes are useless for coordinating with others and reporting. Now, when we go to task list, this is a step up. And note that the principal reasons remain the same, but the magnitude starts to change. With task lists, we're still concerned about the number of items, a small number of items to track, but it's larger than what Post-it notes can effectively manage. Also, we're trying to track things that may have a much longer duration.